Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris in London. Live again, Alexander. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. My voice is slightly strained because there's been so much to discuss and talk about, but in all other respects, I'm absolutely fine. And my voice will certainly hold up for this live stream, just to say. And the
Okay,
live
so
stream I'm going to be doing later this evening for locals as
that's right.
well.
So
Just, just,
what
just, just
time?
to
What
remind
time is
everybody.
that taking place
Yes,
on locals? The
yes,
Duran.locals.com. What time is that
yeah.
taking place?
So it's 1400 hours EDT and 1800 hours Europe, London time.
EDT in the
EDT,
US.
exactly.
Yeah.
In the US.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What time, London?
I believe it's 1800 hours. I will
1800.
check and I'll put,
Yeah.
but I think it is
Okay.
1800. I'm going to put
Yeah.
up a
Because we have the
notification.
EDT, we have that time.
Yeah,
That
because
strange
it's
time
a
difference right now.
strange time difference at the time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that'll be on locals, the
On locals. Yeah.
Duran.locals.com.
Yes.
That live stream. So let's say a quick hello to everyone that is watching us on Odyssey, on Rockfin, Rumble, YouTube, and of course locals. How's everybody doing this afternoon? And a quick shout out to the moderators, Alexander. I see Peter is with us. And I think that's it. Peter's in the house this morning, this midday for me. So thank you, Peter, for moderating. And Alexander, we have a Black Sea ceasefire deal. And we also have some updates on the energy infrastructure. That was also agreed on. And I imagine the next phase to all of this, if everything is agreed on and no one breaks any of these ceasefires, the next phase is a complete ceasefire and the discussion of territory. That's how things are moving, according to the U.S. plan. That is how the U.S. is trying to move this along. But it does appear as if Russia is moving the U.S. towards Istanbul plus June 2024 root causes terms. That's how it seems to me. Your thoughts, Alexander, on everything that was agreed on yesterday, and we'll take the discussion from there.
Absolutely. No, I think what you've just described is the underlying reality of what is happening, but I don't think it fully explains what a very chaotic and disorganized day yesterday was. And I think there's a few things to say here, which I think need to be explained. Because first of all, we had that meeting in Riyadh. The Russians were there, the Americans were there. They spoke for 12 and a half hours. It was all done at expert levels. It was expert teams. We're not talking about, big heavy hitters from the political system, not Lavrov, not Ryabkov on the Russian side, not Rubio or Waltz or Witkov from the American side. The Ukrainians, by contrast, did send a delegation that was made up of people that they would have considered heavy hitters. I mean, they sent their defense minister, they sent military officials, they sent Zelensky's aides, and they came to Riyadh. And already that should set alarm bells because they were sending a delegation that looked much stronger on the face of it than this meeting justified. So 12 and a half hours meeting between the Russians and the Americans, 40 minutes on Sunday between the Americans and the Ukrainians, 30 minutes after the meeting with the Russians, the Americans and the Ukrainians. So the meetings with the Ukrainians were very short. The meetings with the Russians were very long. We were then told after the meeting between the Russians and the Americans that there would be a joint statement by the Americans and the Russians, which would be published. And then that statement was not published. And then a Russian official, a very senior Russian official, who undoubtedly is well informed about what happened, a man called Chizhov, said that the reason the joint statement was not published was because the Ukrainians objected to it. So that was why there was no joint statement. Apparently a draft was agreed, but the Ukrainians didn't actually tell us, they wouldn't let us that statement be published. And then we got several hours of guidance from Moscow, from Peskov, Putin's aide, from Lavrov himself, saying that there would actually be no statement of any kind at all. Nothing in writing would be published, that the discussions basically were still underway, that the Russian negotiators would brief Putin himself. Lavrov gave an interview, which was a very interesting interview for Channel 1, which seemed to suggest that the discussions were still underway with the Americans. And then, towards the evening in Washington, everything went absolutely haywire. And we got two readouts, two very brief readouts from the Americans. One of the discussions with the Russians, one of the discussions with the Ukrainians, both of which spoke about an intention. It was not exactly a statement that a ceasefire had been agreed, but it said that the two sides, Russia and America, had agreed that there would be a ceasefire in the Black Sea. But it was very vague, and it said that the Russians, that there'd been also agreements that commercial shipping would not be used to traffic weapons to Ukraine, and that there would be an inspection regime set out, and that the Americans would assist with the export of Russian foodstuffs. And then a few hours later, the Russians produced an exceptionally thorough and detailed readout. And that basically takes us back to the 2022 grain deal. So there will be no interference with commercial shipping in the Black Sea, provided there is a proper regime of inspections set up to make sure that Ukrainian ships are not used, or ships traveling to Ukraine are not used to traffic weapons. And then an enormous number of provisions of sanctions relief, basically freeing completely Russian exports of agricultural goods from all sanctions. And this goes well beyond the terms of the original 2022 grain agreement, because we also see that there'll be lifting of restrictions on Russian ships involved in agricultural trade, obtaining insurance, for example, things of that kind. I mean, it's very extensive sanctions relief at all. So how did we get there? How did we get from a position where there was going to be no public announcement yesterday to the point where we get all of these public announcements pouring out from Washington, and then especially from Moscow? I think it's very simple. The Americans discovered that Zelensky was about to give a press conference. They became concerned that he was going to put his own spin on the discussions that took place in Riyadh. They rushed out these two readouts, and the Russians, who clearly had not expected that readouts would be published from the Americans, then went out and published their own. Now, what I take from this is that the Russian readout is what the Americans and the Russians agreed with each other. Zelensky, who right across the day yesterday seemed to me to be in the process of having a kind of meltdown, was extremely unhappy about it. He wasn't prepared to have it published in a joint statement. He then went and gave this extraordinary press conference in which he was claiming that all sorts of things had been decided and were not decided, which doesn't seem to reflect the reality at all. So the Americans, in order to preempt that, rushed out their two readouts, and the Russians rushed out their comprehensive readout the following a few hours later. So what we're getting here is a situation where there is an agreement to go back to the 2022 grain deal, but with intrusive inspections of Ukrainian ships, plus far more extensive sanctions relief than was agreed in 2022. And Zelensky's furious about it. The Europeans are very nonplussed about it because most of the sanctions relief has to be undertaken by them. The ball, in other words, has been put in their court. And that, I think, is where we are.
A huge win for Russia.
Absolutely.
The U.S.
Absolutely.
gives up nothing.
No.
I mean, this doesn't really concern U.S. national interest, to be quite honest. So they really don't give up anything.
No.
A huge win for Russia. Big sanctions relief.
Yeah.
And once again, Ukraine takes an L on all of this.
Exactly.
Yeah. That was the result.
That was the real result.
And Europe
very, very, very difficult now for the Europeans. Do they do all of these things that the Americans and the Russians are saying they should agree to? Reconnect. And not just one Russian bank, because it talks about financial institutions. The Russian readout talks about financial institutions involved in grain dealing, trading, or food trading. And that includes fisheries and everything else, by the way, and not just fertilizer and grain, but every conceivable agricultural product. Now, bear in mind that every single Russian bank will have businesses that deal with exports of food to some extent, all the big ones, Sberbank, all of them. So you could even go and, if you wanted to put a very wide interpretation on this Russian readout, you could almost say that all the Russian banks should be granted sanctions relief and reconnected to SWIFT. Obviously, that isn't going to happen. But what do the Europeans do? Do they reinstate Russian insurance on Russian ships rather from Russia trading in foodstuffs? What if you put some food on the ships and at the same time have oil in the hull? What happens then? I mean, which is, again, possible. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that happens. All of these things now, the Europeans are now confronted with. What do they do? Do they go along with this agreement? Do they try to sabotage it? Do they, notice a deafening silence from European leaders and officials over the last couple of hours? And again, the reason we have this agreement presented in this kind of way before the Europeans themselves were briefed or had the opportunity to comment on what the Americans and the Russians had discussed was because of Zelensky's incredible decision yesterday to give this press conference to try to preempt what the Russians and the Americans had agreed. His attempt to basically confuse and muddle everybody by implying that a much more extensive ceasefire, more on his terms, covering ports and other infrastructure, which, by the way, the Russians then published a further statement yesterday, which makes it clear that ports, railways, all that other infrastructure that Zelensky's talking about are not covered by any ceasefire. Anyway, if Zelensky had remained mum, if he'd said nothing yesterday, then, as I say, presumably the Americans would have gone to the Europeans. The Europeans would have had time to adjust and decide what to do. As it is now, they're presented with an American-Russian fait accompli, and it'll be very interesting to see how they react.
Yeah, Zelensky was furious that he wasn't consulted by the U.S. on the sanctions relief, as if he makes any of the sanction decisions.
Yes,
that was why he was so upset. But the readout also spells it out. It says Russia and the U.S. have agreed on both readouts, on the U.S. and on the Russian readouts. It doesn't say Russia, the U.S. and Ukraine. It doesn't say Russia, the U.S., the EU and Ukraine. It doesn't say any of that.
No.
Russia and the U.S. agree. Russia and the U.S. agree.
Yeah.
There's no Ukraine in the equation.
No. There is an American readout about what the Americans and the Ukrainians have agreed. But basically, it's the if you read the readout
in the 30 minutes of talks.
Except 30 minutes of talks. It's just the Americans telling the Ukrainians, look, this is what we've agreed with the Russians. You must agree to it also.
So what Europe is going to do is they're going to do a little bit of everything that you said.
Well,
they're going to try to sabotage. They're going to try to agree to it. There's going to be all kinds of different views on what actions to take. There's going to be all kinds of kicking and screaming.
Yes.
I imagine eventually they're going to have to get in line. Eventually, I
I
don't know how long that's going to take. Maybe it'll take a couple of weeks. Maybe it'll take a couple of months. I
yes.
don't know. But, they're going to put up resistance, but eventually they're going to have to go along with this.
Well, I think that they will have to go along with this, and it will probably take several weeks for them to do so. But the Americans will want it done because they want to move forward to discuss the wider ceasefire and the other issues that you spoke about. And the global South countries will also want to move forward with it because they want the grain deal in the Black Sea, and they also want the restrictions on Russian agricultural exports lifted. So we're going to start to see countries in Africa, in India, the Middle East, they're going to start coming to Brussels and saying to Ursula, look, this is what the Americans and the Russians have agreed with each other. It really isn't reasonable for you to hold out in the way that you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's going to look really bad if they start to sabotage all of this. The
Yes,
EU. The EU is
yes,
going to look really bad.
yes, yes.
The entire world, which would not be a first. But yeah.
No.
Okay, so an interesting development. We are heading towards an Istanbul Plus.
Absolutely, that is exactly where we're going. Now, there were a lot of leaks yesterday, or a lot of claims yesterday, that the Russians, over the course of the meeting in Riyadh, again made it clear that they want the entire 4 regions transferred to them. Now, I'm a bit distrustful of the original story, which appeared in Moscow Times, which is a horrible rag based in Amsterdam, sorry to use those words, which I don't consider to be reliable at all. But I'm convinced that is the Russian position. I don't see any reason to think otherwise. Listening to what Lavrov was saying yesterday on Channel 1, I got no sense that the Russians are shifting on this. I think the Americans are happy to move in that direction. I don't think they have any major fundamental concerns about it. So I think we are moving towards Istanbul Plus, step by step. That is the direction in which we are going.
Yeah, the U.S. loses nothing with Istanbul Plus either.
No, no,
No vital U.S. national
no,
interests are
no,
jeopardized by agreeing to
no.
any of the Russian terms.
Absolutely. And just one very last point. Yesterday, we started to get the first briefings from US intelligence, which basically admitted that the Russians are winning the war in Ukraine. I mean, they prevaricated. One of them said that, it was, that the Ukrainian army has not collapsed anywhere on the front lines, that by the end of the year, both sides will have problems. But overall, it conceded that the Russians are in a stronger position. That came from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that the Russians have much more endurance in this war of attrition than the Ukrainians do. And then we had a much bigger, much more comprehensive intelligence assessment published by the US intelligence community as a whole, which went much further about this, so that in many respects the Russian armed forces are more powerful than they were in 2022, which is unequivocally true, and that even military and intelligence assistance from the West could not help Ukraine win. So you could see that the US intelligence community, in what it is publicly saying, is starting to shift its position from optimism about Ukraine's prospects to realism about Ukraine's prospects.
Yeah. We're delusional again, Alexander. We're delusional. The EU is an American puppet, so what we see is just a circus for the plebes. The plan is to make nations in the EU to borrow money from the US to pay weapons made there. So this is, once again, we get to the point that this is some sort of a plan between the US and the EU, everything that's unfolding.
Well,
It's the fact that the EU might buy weapons from the US. Okay, they already buy weapons from the US, and they'll continue to buy weapons from the US. That I'm not in a disagreement with, but there is no EU US plan in all of this.
no.
The exact opposite.
It's the exact opposite. There is no evidence that there is such a plan. I mean, I think that this is a point which we need to make. The EU leadership are deeply upset and alarmed about what is happening. And by the way, the British media is now starting to publish hit pieces against Giorgia Meloni because she seems to be siding with the Americans now. There's been the first one today, and I gather that more are coming, because she's not prepared to participate in the coalition of the willing, that she's not prepared to raise defense spending, that she's not prepared to do any of these things.
They have no money.
They have no money. They
Greece.
have
I
no
live
money.
in Europe.
Yeah, I know.
Greece has
Yes.
no money.
No.
They're broke.
Nor does-
We're broke.
Nor
does
does
Italy,
Britain.
no one. Nor does Germany.
France. Nor does Germany, really. Exactly.
Go on. I'm sorry. I cut
No,
you
no.
off.
I
You were
mean,
talking
I've
about
said
Maloney.
what I've said what I wanted to say. I mean, I think that when people get angry, when they start saying the things about each other that they are saying, well, I can tell when I can nearly always tell when it's real and when it's not. This time it's real. And all of the indications I'm getting from people in London. And by the way, for the first time throughout this entire crisis, I'm starting to get people in London contact me. I mean, people who up to now have held off from doing so. All of the indications are that there is now growing alarm, growing worry, growing anger, and growing doubt. So that's the reality of what's going on in Europe now.
Okay, what's going on with Stammer's peacekeeper coalition of the willing plan? What's going on with that?
Well, it's disintegrating. There was supposed to be a meeting of chiefs of staff. Most of the European countries didn't turn up. Italy didn't send a representative. Ultimately, it boiled down to just the British and the French, and the British military are reporting back to Starmer. This won't work. Again, there's article after article clearly sourced from within the military saying as much to Starmer. Of course, he doesn't want to hear this, but that's what they're telling him.
And the big defense fund from Ursula, the 800 billion defense fund. What's the deal with that?
Again, there's been more articles now appearing in the British media of all places saying that this is all smoke and mirrors. And Meloni has said so as well, by the way, that Ursula's fund has no reality. It's just a sum of money that she's conjured up out of her head, but she's not actually providing any. It has to be provided by governments, and the governments don't have any money. The only government that thinks it has money is Merz's government. Merz, who's now lifted the debt brake, and he's putting together a 150 billion euro fund for rearmament and a 500 billion euro fund for infrastructure. We've discussed this in program after program. None of this money is going to be used in the way that people think it is. What will happen is that the debt brake is going to lead to a massive expansion of German debt. Already, with German bond yields rising, bond yields of other EU states are rising as well. That is increasing their interest payments. There is actually less money going around. And whatever money is spent in Germany will stay in Germany and will go to all the friends of Friedrich Merz there, Mr. BlackRock. That's what he's up to. He's doing exactly the kind of things that you see in so many places happen. Debt leverage and all of that, and that's what's coming to Germany. No rearmament.
Europeans never learn. Slush funds. All of these things are just slush funds that they're going to divide up amongst their buddies, their pals, their donors. That's all we're talking about. Is they're creating these big, massive slush funds.
The first article in the British media discussing the fact that these are slush funds and using the expression which you coined to describe them has now appeared. I mean, that's all they are. And by the way,
during the COVID, they did the same exact thing.
Exactly. In fact, that article actually made the direct parallel between this slush fund and the COVID slush fund. It said that the COVID slush fund was spent for everything except COVID. I mean, Sanchez in Spain is already saying that some of this money should be used to combat climate change. What does that tell you?
Yeah. He's getting into fights with Kaya Kallas.
Absolutely.
European officials are upset with Ursula, saying she's incompetent.
Yes.
Stammer's running around talking about an incursion into Ukraine, and no one wants to join him. No. Macron is flip-flopping back and forth. One day he's saying, yeah, I'll join you. The next day he's saying, no, I'm not. The whole thing's a freaking mess. So we go, okay, so we go back to what the Russians and the US have put out there, and the fact that the Europeans, kicking and screaming, are going to probably agree with what the US is telling them to do.
Yes. I mean, it will take a while. But eventually, that's the point to which we will come.
All right. Anything else you want to add? The very alarming situation with journalists. The fact that
I think this
appears
is
to really be going after journalists very hard.
And I think this is an important story. I mean, even our friend Patrick Lancaster was targeted. I mean, he's actually done a video about this. So Ukraine is now engaging in what is clearly a campaign to eliminate journalists, to eliminate witnesses. And this is almost certainly partly a byproduct of the disaster in Kursk. But it's also, I am sure, a sign that the Ukrainian leadership are expecting major military reversals over the next few weeks, and they don't want reporters out there describing them. It's incredibly cruel. It's incredibly cynical. It's, in fact, evil. And there is no comment about it anywhere in the media in the West.
Yeah. Okay, let's answer some questions, and we'll wrap up this stream. Is there anything else you want to add before we
No,
that's it. That's about the deal? I think we covered.
Absolutely.
We covered it. Okay. Nikos says, don't have much to ask, but one thing really puzzles me lately. How did Ukraine, a country so close to Russia, become like this, worshipping Nazi ideology? How did Lviv make the population like this?
This is a huge story that goes back long way. I mean, I think that the important thing to remember is that Ukraine is a place made up of 3 different regions. So there's Eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, which is overwhelmingly Russian speaking, was part of Russia since the 17th century. Then there is Central Ukraine, which is Ukrainian speaking, but Orthodox, closely aligned with Russia, formerly part of the Russian Empire, part of the Soviet Union from its inception, basically, historically quite friendly to Russia. And then there's Western Ukraine, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then of Poland, which is either Catholic or Uniate, which speaks Ukrainian language, and which has a long history of hostility to Russia. What happened after Ukraine became independent is that the western regions of Ukraine basically came to dominate the political discourse in Ukraine itself.
From Nikos, and to that, a follow-up to his question, and to that, I want to point out Golden Dawn in Greece. They rose to power at the same period as the Maidan and had the same agenda with Azov, wanting to confront Turkey. Why did we throw them out, and did the West fund them?
I don't know. I think Alex knows a lot more about Golden Dawn.
Yeah, that's a huge question as well.
It's a huge question.
Thrown out. Well, they got into those issues with the murder of the rapper Nikos, if I remember that whole scenario. That situation. And from that point on, Golden Dawn pretty much disintegrated after that entire affair. So that was the situation with Golden Dawn. But that's a big topic as well. Yeah.
We ought to do a program about Greece sooner or later. I mean, it's the situation. But there's a lot of other things to talk about too.
There's a lot of stuff to talk about, and Greece at the end of the day, Alexander, Greece is just going to follow along.
Well, indeed.
with whatever the EU or the US, whatever direction they're moving towards. It will be interesting to see whether they move more towards the Trump direction or if they move more towards the Ursula direction.
Indeed.
That will be interesting to follow.
Yeah.
Nikos says, someone pointed out yesterday that Americans get along well with Russians. There's a channel called Expat American that showcases this reality. He has formed a small community of Americans, British, and Ukrainians, and the Catholic who all live in Russian. Stanislav Krepivnik is his friend. By the way, you should definitely invite him on to your channel.
Yeah. Okay. That's certainly a thought. Yes. Thank you, Nikos.
Thank you, Nikos. Sanjeva says, fourth Russian journalist killed today, female from Channel 1. It was a drone.
Yeah.
Targeted killing. What is Russia doing about this?
Well, I mean, they're complaining vigorously about this. It's difficult for them to do much more. I mean, than they're doing already, I would have thought. I mean, the fact is that Ukraine is now intentionally targeting journalists, war reporters, and that is a terrible thing.
Sir Musgame says, de Gaulle said the Rhine is more narrow than the Atlantic. Fast forward, the Napier is even more narrow than the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Andrea says, so Russia sets terms for ceasefire and says that if Ukraine breaches it, they will take Odessa. If the USA sign the agreement, are they accepting that ultimatum?
Yes, essentially, that's exactly what they are. We're not there yet. I mean, there's a long way to go. But, I mean, that was what Putin said at the meeting with the industrialists. I think we should take all this very seriously.
It's a long way to go, and it's going to be very bumpy.
Yeah.
And Trump is going to say some stuff in a week or two, which is going to upset everyone and may turn everything upside down, but eventually it'll get back on course. We've seen this play out over the past
We've seen absolutely.
month. Yeah.
And can I just say, as somebody who's been involved in many negotiations in my life, bumps and quarrels and arguments and moments when everything seems to break down, it's absolutely what happens in every big negotiation I've ever been involved in. People should not let themselves be thrown off balance by it. Look at the overall direction of travel, and that's always the most important thing to stick to.
And the key point is that Russia and the US want to normalize relations beyond Ukraine.
Exactly. That is the key. There's even been an article about this in the New York Times now.
And Lavrov even said it yesterday in his interview.
Exactly.
I mean, he said it straight up.
Yes.
That Russia and the US want to normalize relations.
Normal. Exactly.
Yeah. Ralph Steiner says Kaya Kallas will be screaming Banshee after this.
Yes. I think so. Well, she'll be phoning Zelensky and they'll be screaming at each other. Just to say.
Lover of the Russian team says sick of this pointless loss of life.
Yeah.
Sanjeva says, this is one of two. I am not sure if Putin is reading the Russian public correctly. My wife is Russian and her friends can't be any more liberal and pro-Western, but almost to the person, they want a definitive end to the war with Russian victory. They are against giving up any land. They were anti-war before the war. They want victory now that the war has started and gone for 3 years. There is no fatigue. I wonder if Putin realizes this.
I think he does realize it, and that is why that he's taking a very hard line. I think deep down, he absolutely wants to see Odessa back under Russian control. And I think that will remain his long-term objective. But back last year, he said the 4 regions, and for the moment, he has to stick to that.
That's exactly what he said. In June 2024, Putin's terms were the 4 regions. That's what he said. Yeah.
Yes.
Keep in mind, Alexander, that it's also extremely difficult to capture a city like Odessa. That's going to be a huge undertaking. Or Kiev, or even Dnipropetrovsk, which is a huge urban city.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Odessa, there's a further factor, which is, remember, it's a World Heritage City. You don't want it destroyed in the way that Bakhmut was. Just saying.
Commando Crossfire says, good day. Mir, survive, swift return. Will the Mir card survive the swift return?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, the Russians will make absolutely I mean, they've been saying this. I mean, there's been a whole series of statements Russian officials making it quite clear that there's not going to be any return to pre-2022 or indeed pre-2014 Russian world.
Yeah. Mark Esposito, welcome to the Duran community. Kuplex says, will NATO push harder in the Baltic Sea instead?
Yes, I think some NATO countries will. But of course, again, if there is an overall normalization of relations between America and Russia, it's going to be very difficult to sustain this aggressive policy, even in the the Baltic Sea, because the spirit will have gone out of it. You cannot maintain war hysteria in Europe, if the relations between the two great powers are actually improving. That's going to be an impossible challenge for European governments to sustain.
Deus Abscondis says, can you guys get Richard Sakwa on for a program? Where does he stand these days?
No, he does. I mean, he's excellent. We've done programs with him on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself, and maybe we should do further ones. Absolutely. But we should have him on one of our live streams too. Yes.
Ralph Steiner says, could Britain blow up Nord Stream again and stop it?
Yes.
Lavrov mentioned Nord Stream.
Yeah, absolutely. He did. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, if the Americans get a share in it, it might not be a very wise thing to do. It's an interesting idea. I wonder who came up with it, by the way.
It makes sense. Orban came up with it.
Oh,
because that
really?
was his idea. He talked about that 6 months ago, about setting up a joint venture with Russia to get the oil or the gas into Hungary.
Well, he's a very, very clever man, and this is a very, very clever idea.
Yeah. Ralph Steiner says, Germany and Russia together is a British nightmare.
True. Absolutely true. Whenever the Germans and the Russians come together, in Europe, they sweep the board. That's been an iron rule since the late 18th century. So the play in Europe is to keep them apart.
Sir Musgame says, did Putin just invent diplomatic attrition to copy Paul Keating? Putin wants to do Trump slowly, oh so slowly, dim the lights. You can guess the rest.
Well, I think to some extent, but I think also it's important to remember that what Putin is doing is that he is responding to what Trump is doing. Trump is the person with the initiative here. So what Putin says is, to every Trump initiative, yes, but, and then it's the but that is the key, because ultimately he has conceded nothing so far, and that's the most important thing to say.
Tyler Durden says, a temporary Istanbul Plus is likely, in my opinion. The U.S. is deploying stealth bombers to the Middle East. This means they will probably strike Yemen and maybe Iran and can't focus on Ukraine.
This is absolutely true, and it's a very, very worrying and concerning development as well. The situation in the Middle East is spiraling out of control, and I don't think Trump understands how dangerous it is. J.D. Vance does.
Tulsi Gabbard does.
Tulsi Gabbard does, apparently.
She said to the Senate yesterday that Iran is not building nukes.
Exactly.
So that means that she's giving Trump, going off of her testimony, it means she's giving Trump reliable information. If you go off of what she said yesterday.
Yes. Yeah.
William says, I repeat, as Trump wants to own it, stop faffling with interim deals. A huge faff to agree for Kiev to wreck. Cut to a bilateral final deal with a new constitution. Cut all aid. Kiev will soon agree.
Well, can I just say we can't go over this again and again and again. Alex and I have always taken the view that in Trump's own interests, he should have stayed out of the whole Ukraine settlement process. He took a different decision. He decided to become involved. I suspect he was led into this by Kellogg and Waltz. I don't think it works to his advantage, but in the end, I still think we're going to get the agreement that Trump wants.
Sir Musgame says, Gonzalo being smeared by super creepy U.S.-Ukraine intel asset on Kim Iverson. Is something coming down the pike about his murder? I don't know.
I've heard about this.
On Team Iverson.
I can't imagine that they can smear him any more than they have already done. The reality of his murder speaks for itself. And the reality of the kind of reporter he was, well, you can still find his programs.
Studio Reiner says, how is Greece broke when it formed the entire Western world? We owe them historical debt.
True. Thank you for reminding everyone.
Justina Oska, thank you for that super sticker. Commander Crossfire says, considering the facts on the ground, the 4 regions seems a minimal ask, like being up 9-1 in a football match and in the second half and asking the other side to quit.
Yes. You see, many people in Russia are saying this. They're saying, is it, we're on the brink of victory and we're going to just stick with the 4 regions? We're going to get Zaporozhye and that's it. I mean, there are lots of people in Russia who are saying this, and it's going to be a very hard sell for Putin. But it's the position that he took in June of last year, and I think just like others here, I think he probably also calculates that if he gets the 4 regions, even if there is a truce, it still won't be the end of the Ukraine story. There'll be an awful lot of other things happen. And by that point, he will be in a position, Russia will be in a position of overwhelming advantage, especially and particularly if he gets the military aid from the West to Ukraine stopped, which I think is his overriding priority. Not just NATO membership now, but descaling the Ukrainian military and all that.
And elections.
Yeah.
Ralph Steiner says, cannot Britain attack a closer nation like France?
Don't put those ideas into Starmer's head, please.
Jamila says, the West lost everything because religion left.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but that's a big topic which beyond what we can discuss here.
Studio Rayner says, all the debt is owned in the Vatican. The Vatican is in debt to the Greeks. That's how millennia-old debt works.
Well, I'm not sure who it is in Greece who holds the debt because I've never met them. And I know quite a lot of people in Greece.
Sir Most Game says, Herr Steimer and the conga line of EU weirdos have been hoisted by their own petard. Europeans stopped breeding cannon fodder over 50 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, what we have seen is a collapse in European statesmanship. I mean, they just don't do it anymore. They've relied on the Americans, and it never occurred to them that the Americans have their own interests, which are separate from their own.
Marion Holtzman says, Daddy Trump and Papa Putin are breaking bread. Oh my, and the Europeans are losing their minds, just like the Democrats here in the US.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for that awesome super chat. Oscar N says, the kids Ukraine won't back that Putin stole, did not those kids come from Donbass, and that is Russia?
Well, the whole I'm not going to get into this whole story here, but I mean, I used to do an awful lot of child abduction cases. This does not fulfill the terms of child abduction, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, briefly, with children evacuated from a war zone from Donbass, exactly as you say. I am not up to date with this story, but I understand that in every single case up to about 6 months ago, where the family had come back and asked for the children to be returned, they were returned. So I don't understand what the issue is, legally speaking.
Sir Musgame says, Ukraine is giving Trump a migraine, just putting it out there.
Yeah, it's true.
Matthew says, is Putin selling out the military here by accepting this deal, which will likely be broken to appease the Russian oligarchs?
No, he's not. I think, again, this is a widespread narrative, but to repeat again, up to this point, he has conceded nothing. I mean, he's conceded nothing that the military would take objection to. The military are not interfering with commercial shipping in the Black Sea. This is what makes this whole Black Sea deal so bizarre in some ways, because it's predicated on the assumption that, the Russians are operating some kind of blockade in the Black Sea. They are not. They never have done. There's never been a time when they've seized a single commercial ship on the Black Sea. I can't remember one, at least.
It stops the military ships from entering the Black Sea. Well, when they
Absolutely.
used to
Well,
back in the grain deal days, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's a different story. Exactly.
And,
of course.
no, I was going to say, and more importantly, the sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely. The military, from a military point of view, this makes no difference. The same goes for the 30-day ceasefire, which now the Russians, by the way, have backdated to March 18th. So we're now looking at a relatively short time. So that, again, doesn't change the military calculus at all. Of course, if the 30-day ceasefire is extended, then over time it will start to make a difference, because then Ukraine may be able to undertake some repairs to its energy system. They can't do that within a 30-day timescale. My own guess is what the Russians will probably do is they will complain about Ukrainian violations of the truce, which are taking place. They will then extend their own commitment for perhaps another 30 days. They'll keep it rolling, as they did with the grain deal, until eventually they decide it doesn't work any longer and they will resume their missile strikes. Or in the alternative, we finally get movement towards a full ceasefire. But that will clearly happen only in conjunction with a overall peace agreement being, at least not finalized, at least starting to shape, and that will be Istanbul Plus.
Ralph Steiner says, Alexander, when British Spitfires take to the skies over Germany on the 8th of May, VE Day, and you hear the roar of Merlin engines, will you stand proudly?
Well, no, not especially. I mean, I absolutely do consider, the victory in Europe to be an enormous event, to which, of course, Britain played a very key contribution. The biggest contribution to the victory of the Allies in the Second World War over Germany was played by Russia, the Soviet Union, and they, of course, celebrate their victory day on the 9th of May. And therefore, for that reason, that's the day I consider the important one.
Boa Omega says, maybe Tommy Robinson is meant to be an object lesson on the crime of unauthorized journalism and wrong-think political views in Europe.
He has been hounded. Lawfare against him has been off the scale. I say that as somebody who is not an admirer any more than, say, Nigel Farage is. But I mean, the way he's been treated has been appalling. But it is symptomatic of what is going on to lots of people in Britain now. You say something wrong on X, you can have the police turning up at your door.
Incredible. Altonam says, if there are elections in Ukraine, isn't there a risk that pro-NAZI candidate wins, says Zaluzhny, making things worse, not better for the Russians?
The Americans and the Russians seem to be agreed that they do not want Zaluzhny standing. This seems to be the general consensus. But you're absolutely right. If there are elections, there's no predictability about the outcome. The Russians, I think, absolutely do want Medvedchuk eventually to become leader of Ukraine. The Americans are focused on Tymoshenko. I can't imagine that Tymoshenko is going to be that different in the end. She'll be more intelligent and more consistent, but she's not going to be able to change the underlying policy lines. I don't know how this is going to play out. And the danger that you've set out is a real one. I don't think those people, by the way, have a huge amount of support in Ukraine. But what the general mood in Ukraine is, it's very difficult to judge at the moment.
Without U.S. money and support, the Banderites are finished.
Yeah, probably. I think that's probably true, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, they only became the force that they did because they had that support in the first place. And the reason they got that support was because they were the only people in Ukraine who in the 90s and early 2000s were reliably anti-Russian.
Exactly. AZ Barry 1 says, will Russia finally stop selling energy to the EU to prevent using it for making more weapons?
Well, they've never said that. We'll see what comes. To be frank, if resumption of energy supplies from Russia comes to Europe, well, it will be impossible to see that as anything other than a massive defeat for Scholz, Scholz, Ursula, Habeck, Baerbock, all that awful bunch, and Starmer and all the others, Johnson as well. I mean, it would be for them everything going back to a situation where Putin has won the game in every single one of its parts. Just saying.
Brumagem 101 says, have you guys heard of the new 1.5 billion ski resort being built in the Carpathians near Lviv, funded mainly by Vanguard, BlackRock, and Goldman Sachs?
Absolutely. I have heard about it, and it's to say something, it's an obscene idea at a time of war, but it does tell you a bit about the kind of things that some people are planning in Ukraine. By the way, I should make it absolutely clear that I think it's another fraud, another scam, basically. I mean, you pour in the money, whether they'll anything be actually built is a completely different matter.
Studio Rayner says, remember, journalists equals intelligence, so I'd be surprised not to see this at the end of a major conflict.
Well, yes, I think there's some truth to this, but some of these journalists are real people who are real journalists. Patrick Lancaster does not work for any intelligence agency. Of that I know, and he is clearly being targeted too. Just watch his video; you will see it all set out there.
From New 2 says, so guys, every bit counts for better. Look after yourselves. Cheers from Australia.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. Sir Mugs Game says, the only thing in Russia's court is Ukraine, and it has been found and judged guilty. Putin's donned the black cap. Just putting it out there again.
That's one way of putting it. The black cap, by the way, is what British judges used to put on their heads when they not only found someone guilty, but were preparing to sentence them to death. That's where it comes from.
Commando Crossfire says, Armenia said to revive relations with Russia due to geopolitical realities. In depth to this, or just Armenian Erdogan?
Well, I think that is Armenian Erdogan. I think Pashinyan has no real liking for Russia. The fact that he's taking this step is a sign of extraordinary defeat. And can I just say something? I mean, there was a meeting between Aliyev and Putin just a short time ago, which went really very well. And then a joint celebration meeting of Putin, Aliyev, and two Central Asian leaders. I forget which ones. The Tajik leader was one of them. And then Aliyev is coming to Moscow for the 9th of May. So, I mean, Pashinyan has played this game for Armenia disastrously. It's been a catastrophe. And if he now starts to turn back to Moscow, he's sacrificed so much for nothing.
He bet on Biden, he bet on the EU, and now he's turning back to Russia.
To Russia.
What a disaster for Pashinyan. Yeah. He really bet on the wrong side.
Yeah.
David says, the USA is trying to deceive Russia again. Why do you guys keep giving a pass to the USA crimes? The USA is responsible for all the ongoing crimes in Ukraine and Middle East. Ukraine is doing exactly as the USA orders.
No, well, first of all, we've never given pass to US crimes in any conceivable way. We've discussed them and analyzed them and come under enormous pressure for doing so. And in no way do we take back anything of what we said. But there are objective reasons in terms of American national interests why the US would be adjusting its policies over Ukraine. And the overriding one is that Russia is winning the war in Ukraine, and the United States has many, many other problems that it needs to take into account. And that is why we have this process underway. It's not because the Americans have become angels. Nobody in international affairs is an angel. Absolutely not. It is because the Americans are acting in their own self-interests. And for that reason, they have to try and get themselves out of this losing war in Ukraine. That's all.
Go back to our videos from 6 months ago where we say that this is a proxy war between the United States, the collective West, and Russia. But in those videos, we make it very clear that in this proxy war between the collective West and Russia, whether people like it or not, the United States always has the ability to walk away from this and not suffer any major consequences. It's Europe that's going to have the problem. And that is what that's what it looks like the Trump administration is trying to do. They're trying to wind this thing down, and they're not going to suffer any huge consequences. That's just the reality of how this thing is played out.
Absolutely. For them, getting out of this now is a plus. For the US, it's a plus.
Yeah, and they're going to normalize relations with Russia, and that's just the way this is going to work. And this is something that Russia wants.
Yes.
You know, we're not here to tell them this is good or bad or whatever. This is what the Putin administration has seen is in Russia's best interests.
Yeah.
Sebastian Lebeck, welcome to the Duran community. Jamila says, I don't have faith on Trump because he said straight away he wants to stop the ceasefire, but he never stopped even the weapons.
Well, again, we have a negotiation underway. He hasn't given away anything up to now that affects American interests. The Russians haven't either. He's now at least started a negotiation process, and he's established contacts with the Russians, and that takes us a lot further than we saw under Biden, who was instead escalating the war all the time. It's something. It's movement. It is real movement, and one can't deny it.
Yeah. Peter NH says, if I may, if Russia wants to normalize relations with its neighbors, it needs to apologize for its past in Central Europe and Central Asia. The Germans apologized and Europe moved on.
Yeah, the Russians have apologized many times. Again, this isn't a fact that people seem to understand, but there have been many, many apologies on many occasions. They've apologized about Hungary in the 1956 events, which is one reason they get on well with Orban, by the way, who participated in those events. They've apologized about Katyn and all of that, to the dismay of some people in Russia. But it's not that they haven't apologized. It's that people continue to demand from them more and more and more all the time.
They've apologized, and when it comes to the Soviet Union, they've taken on the debt and they've paid all that debt.
Absolutely.
They did all these things.
Yeah. Yes.
Studio Rainer says, do you think part of the deal was to sack Erdogan for making things difficult with Syria? The Turks are a long-term train wreck for Israel, and saving Assad alive might be for a reason.
No, I did think it's as complicated as this. I mean, I think Erdogan may be in serious political trouble. I think he will get through this crisis in the end, which he has probably, planned in advance. But I don't think the Russians or the Americans at this time want to see him go, because he's a leader that they have come to understand and know they can work with up to a certain limited point. Whereas if he goes, there's just too much uncertainty. And I think neither the Americans nor the Russians want more uncertainty in the Middle East than what they already have.
Jack says, so if Hegseth is pushing the EU to arm up Ukraine, how on earth is that de-escalation and zero weapons cut off? Duran Trump hopium is embarrassing.
What EU weapon sent to Ukraine? I mean, this is exactly what we've discovered over the last couple of weeks. They hadn't been able I mean, they can't supply Ukraine with air defense systems. The fighter jets they send to Ukraine don't work. The Ukraine is already complaining about the Mirages. They aren't able to send any more howitzers because they've run out of howitzers. There are no European weapons in any quantity that can be sent to Ukraine. All the key weapons are being supplied by the United States.
And when Zelensky asked Trump for patriots, what did Trump say? I'll ask the Europeans.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the U.S. doesn't have the weapons to send to Ukraine. What weapons are being sent to Ukraine right now is from what I understand, and we talked about this in a video, Alexander, is the drawdown package from Biden.
Yes.
Which Trump does not want to touch for his own negotiating leverage political reasons. Understood. He doesn't want to touch it. He's letting the drawdown, the money, the weapons go, and they're going to run out in summer.
Yeah.
That package is going to be done in the summer. So what does Trump do? Does he go to Congress and go to the American people and say, I want another $60 billion for Ukraine?
Yeah.
Is that going to fly with the American people?
No.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons that he also wants to wind this thing down. Everyone realizes that come summertime, which is what Budanov said, come summertime, there are going to be no weapons. There's going to be no money.
Exactly.
Sir Muggs Game says, before Trump realizes it, his admin will be a lame duck a la Orange. He needs to move Torah, the Greek Torah, not the Hebrew nor Japanese Torah.
Well, I mean, he's got enormous problems ahead of him, but discussing the whole future of the Trump administration is perhaps outside the scope of this live stream, if I could say that. I mean, it's something we do need to talk about, and we need to do more programs with Robert Barnes and others. What I will say, though, is that the Democrats are sinking like a stone. I mean, they are the popularity of the Democratic Party continues to fall. And at the moment, they're apparently looking to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as their future hope for 2028, for which all I can say is, my goodness. That's basically my own feeling about it.
Jungle Jin says, wonder where the Skripals' bodies are buried. Good
question. I would love to know.
Sir Musgame says, Putin should offer to rename the Donbass Donald Pass. Sir Musgame says, Trump, the organ grinder, is shaking down the EU and the Ukraine monkeys. That's not how it's supposed to work.
Exactly. That's true. That's exactly what's happening.
Panos says, on a separate note, we all see each and both of you going strength to strength, better and better. Do you ever reflect on that? Because make such a part of my day and others.
We just do what we do. We enjoy doing it. It's very hard work, but we just do what we do. I mean, if we spend our time thinking about those things, I think it would just distract us from our work.
Thank you, Panos, for that. Denise says, have you noticed how much more the truth is showing through versus the lies we were told these last 4 years?
Absolutely. Gradually, I mean, we're starting to see more and more of the truth come through, but only still a very small part of it. I think the fact that the US intelligence community are now shifting ground, and I don't think this is, by the way, because Tulsi and Radcliffe have come in. I think this has been gradually building up for some time. The fact that that's coming through, expect sometime in midsummer a new assessment from the US intelligence community, taking us even further down to the point of how big the changes are, how bad the situation is.
Alexander G says, Alex and Alexander are spot on. This will be resolved on Russia's terms. Russia will always be sustainable without the West.
Correct.
Sir Musgame says, Putin also invented the complement of discord. Lit a candle for Trump, so he schmoozes Trump and at the same time gives Trump's critics ammo. Nice.
Yeah, I mean, Putin does understand Trump very, very well, and he does obviously know how to deal with Trump in a way that promotes Russian interests. I'm going to say this: Putin is not a manipulative man. I've seen him twice in action. I mean, I've been in rooms where he gave a public speech and went through a Q&A. He's actually very straightforward and very direct, as Witkoff discovered. He is not a manipulative man in the way that Starmer is, to some extent. Macron definitely is. And, well, of course, with Zelensky off the scale.
Dykes Brat says, you guys think there will be a punishment expedition from Russia, Donbass, against the Galatians? Things after such war can get messy. Revenge exists.
Well, it absolutely does exist, but I would say something. It's not actually very much a Russian characteristic. I mean, they fought far too many wars to let themselves get too distracted by ideas of revenge. So I don't assume that that is going to happen. I think the Russian feeling at the moment is if they can win the war, then Western Ukraine can go hang and take care of itself. I think that's mostly the sentiment in Russia at the moment.
Raul Pinto says, is there any information on whether the EU war bonds issued to finance the Ukrainian conflict are being addressed during the Russia-US negotiations?
No, I'm sure they're not. I'm sure the Russians are going to let the Europeans destroy themselves economically. Why wouldn't they?
Commander Crossfire says, thoughts on US tariffs against anyone trading with Venezuela, embargo incoming, another blockade. Why has regime changed not worked there yet?
Well, why indeed? That's a whole separate question. All I'm going to say in this program is that if Venezuelan heavy oil is not trading on global markets, then given that the United States imports heavy oil because its refineries apparently tend to work with heavy oil, if they can't get it from Venezuela, apparently the only other place they can get it from is Russia. And that points to sanctions relief for Russian energy coming fairly soon. Just saying.
Sir Musgame says, the Russians have realized that dealing with the U.S. is, as you Greeks are fond of saying, don't bother knocking on a deaf man's door.
Well, I think that the Russians have gone into these negotiations in a very tough-minded way. I think that they probably understand perfectly well that, going down the line, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, a new administration might appear, which is again hostile to themselves. But they also understand that they have a president and an administration which does want to normalize and improve relations with them. And they're going to take advantage of that in their own interests. It's as simple as this.
Jules Signora, thank you for that super chat. Ralph Steiner says, the Germans apologize for bombing Pearl Harbor?
Well, no, they didn't, because they didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. I mean, the Japanese did. So I'm not quite sure what that refers to, by the way.
From the other side, an Australian in Minsk, Belarus. Absolutely epic show again. The topics are spot on. Keep up the amazing work. Hello from Minsk.
Thank you very much.
To Minsk. Cool channel from the other side in Australian Minsk in Belarus. Ozy Ben K says, regarding your comment yesterday, the collective West may not like orthodoxy, but a number of us are converting.
I know. And lots of people are, I mean, in the local church that there is here in where I live, which is an Anglo-Catholic one. It's part of the Anglican Church, but fairly close to Catholicism in some ways. I know a lot of the people there are slowly drifting to Orthodoxy as well. But I talked about the political elite. They don't like Christianity, and they particularly don't like Orthodoxy.
Ralph Steiner says, was the bombing of Dresden a little over the top?
The bombing of Dresden, in my opinion, was a crime. That's my own perspective. It came at the very, very end of the war. It served no particular military purpose. It destroyed one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. It's not, by the way, to defend Germany or Nazis or anybody like that. But I think the way it happened was terrible. And there was a huge amount of outrage about it in Britain at the time, to the point where the leader of the British Air Force at that time, Arthur Harris, had to call a meeting to try to explain to the people that, this was absolutely fine. And he got a philosopher who delivered a speech in which he explained about the ethics of bombing. And somebody, a churchman, stood up and said, we haven't heard a speech about the ethics of bombing. We've heard one about the bombing of ethics. So that's my own view about Dresden. Sorry.
Nigel says, Alexander, will Farage be better for the UK?
Well, huge journey to go. And I have to say this, he's not somebody that I've ever thought of as a potential prime minister. I don't think he's ever thought of himself as a potential prime minister. But he's now teaming up with Dominic Cummings. It looks as if he's gradually coming round to that view himself, that may be where it comes. Given how badly Britain is being governed, given how terrible the strategies are at the moment, who's to say? Maybe, possibly, a Farage government might be the way forward. I'm still trying to work out my own views about this. What I can say is that the situation here is getting worse all the time.
Ralph Steiner says, why the Yanks send smiley emojis as they bomb Yemen?
Well, I think that's awful and terrible, but there it is. Americans tend to do this with each other, by the way. Again, I've been in many meetings with Americans. The chat that took place is, in my opinion, absolutely typical of how high-powered Americans behave when they are with each other.
Mark Esposito says, America has always acted in its perceived best interests. The problem was in the perception, not the motivation.
Yes.
Bo Omega says, $1 for the cat treat fund for Alexander's cat. Sir Mugscape says, in Macron's first official portrait photo, he stood in front of de Gaulle's desk and opened his memoir and placed it behind his right hand. No wonder the U.S. views every French president as de Gaulle.
Well, indeed. Macron is not de Gaulle, just to say. They're more two presidents, more unlike French presidents, more unlike, be difficult to imagine.
Petros says, what you mentioned yesterday about American politicians hostile to orthodoxy, Orthodox Church in America is exploding with converts in spite of that.
I absolutely accept this, but the political class doesn't like this. I've experienced this myself. The amount of times when I mentioned that I'm an Orthodox Christian, the amount of times in Britain people bring up Rasputin, they know very little about, by the way, is astonishing.
William says, is Russia benefiting from the interim deals? Extra face time, more rapport. Russia and US look like good guys, and the UK, Kiev, and EU look like scamps. And as they are winning, they can't be bullied.
You're putting it exactly correctly. I mean, the very process of normalization is helping the Russians. I mean, to give an example, Russian oil exports are booming now because despite all the restrictions that Biden put in place a few weeks ago, nobody's paying any attention to them because nobody believes that the Americans are going to enforce them.
The EU leaders are idiots. Just get on a plane and go to Moscow.
Exactly.
But who are they going to send? Ursula, Kaya? Who are they going to send?
Well, exactly.
But that's what they should be doing. Getting on a plane and going to Moscow and doing as the Trump administration is doing.
Absolutely.
Try to figure out some way to get past everything that's happened in Ukraine. And Lavrov and the Russians have said, if they want to come to Moscow, we're open to it.
Absolutely. Can I just say, everybody should go and watch on Alex's channel the video when he discussed the quarrel between Sanchez and Kaya Kallas, because I think that tells the whole thing. Because I think deep down, Sanchez understands the point Alex has just made, and he understands that this high representative, Kaya Kallas, is incapable of conducting negotiations, certainly not with the Russians. So that's why he's looking to find someone else to take her place.
And that's Sanchez. He hasn't been friendly to Russia. But he
to put
realizes
in
it's
mind.
over.
It's over.
Corey Hunter says, hello from Australia. The Australian media is putrid. You guys and other independent media are the antidote. Thanks for sensible analysis. Thank you, Corey, for that. Commander Crossfire says, Western Ukraine, Baltic states, ungrateful, spoiled children, homeless, living on the street, out of their minds because daddy didn't love them enough.
Oh, well, I think that's a good description as any, Frank.
Right. Ralph Steiner says, Pearl Harbor and Germans refer to Animal House movie. Ah, okay. Yes, you're right, Ralph Steiner. That was an Animal House.
It was an Animal
Yeah.
House. Long time since I've watched that film, by the way.
Yeah. I have to give it a rewatch. Sir Bugs Gabe says, Pierce Morgan's midlife crisis. Instead of buying a Porsche, he bought a Zelensky.
That's actually brilliant. That's so fun. That's very good, actually.
Elliot says, why don't Russia solve Zelensky a different way with a rocket ship? Send him to be an astronaut.
But Putin explained it very well. He said, up to now, having Zelensky in place has worked to Russia's advantage. Why would we want to replace him with somebody better, but clever and better organized and more rational, who might actually win support for Ukraine and organize its defense properly?
Jungle Jin says, I'm an Australian, but find it harder to understand what is happening here than most places. The media here is abominable, and we don't have outstanding talking heads such as yourself and Andre.
It's not that different in Britain, by the way. I mean, we don't have much of an independent media here either, surprisingly, surprising as it sounds. Well, thank you for what you said about us. And I mean, for Australia, I'm very sorry to hear that, because Australia always used to be, for me, a country which was, assertive in its defense of its own, of people's rights to speak out. But there it is.
Elliot says, YouTube super chat doesn't let me make that clearer.
Okay.
Thank you, Elliot. Ralph says, all the Black Sea crap is a way for the U.S. Navy to get vessels into the Black Sea.
No, I don't agree. I don't see how. I don't see in what way this this grain deal actually facilitates that. At the moment, there's no sign that the Americans want to send their ships to the Black Sea. And certainly the Russians would not agree to that.
QCat says, great commentary. Thank you. Zarael says, don't forget Sikorsky also sent emojis after Nord Stream.
I know.
True. Joe Public says, MAGA, when was America ever great?
Well, that's a good question. I think it was. Well, it certainly was powerful and certainly did stand for a great deal once upon a time. My father, who was a diehard leftist, I mean, a very, very committed leftist, and who opposed American policies throughout the 50s and 60s and was arrested at times and had all kinds of issues in Greece. He always had a great admiration for the United States, despite all of that, because for him, it did actually stand for something, despite the fact that he opposed it, or things that he admired.
Sir Musgame says, Patriarch Kirill be warned, 100% of Protestant converts joining Russian Orthodoxy watch them like a hawk. The last time, just putting it out there.
Well, I mean, but Kirill is, of course, the orthodoxy that people are joining in Britain is not directly subordinate to Patriarch Kirill, I should say. I mean, because he's the Patriarch of Russia, just to say.
Dionysia says the European political media class have whipped their populace into such a frenzy of Russophobia. How would the people react to diplomatic contacts with Russia?
I think that if the hysteria stops, they'll accept it. I don't think the hysteria has embedded itself very deeply into the national, the popular mind. Some people, within the intelligentsia in the West, deeply Russophobic, and they will never change.
From Quantum Zen. So what you guys are suggesting as the most probable way forward is essentially the Vietnam War scenario. Peace deal, U.S. walks away, war resumes, probably with EU-supported Ukraine. War ends with Russia taking Odessa and Kharkiv. Am I getting it right?
Well, I discussed this possibility in my program yesterday, and I think it is one possible outcome out of many, and a not implausible one. But that takes us quite a lot of the way forward, and I don't quite know how it will end up. I mean, can I just say there is a strong possibility that we won't end the war in that way, that there will be elections in Ukraine, that there could be a swing towards a more pro-Russian candidate, and that Ukraine breaks up, Western Ukraine goes its own way, Central Ukraine then starts to reposition itself into a kind of bigger version of Belarus. I think that's an equally plausible outcome. It's one that Lukashenko, by the way, has floated.
Sparky says Dresden was Martin Luther's area. The bombing destroyed the city, which inspired MLK Seniors to change he and his son's name from Michael King to Martin Luther King. He visited Dresden in the early 1930s.
Absolutely, and it caused an enormous amount of devastation, cultural devastation as well. Artworks, the entire whole libraries destroyed. I mean, a composer, for example, Italian composer that I particularly like, Albinoni. 90% of his musical scores were stored in Dresden, and they were completely destroyed. And because they weren't copied, they have now been irretrievably lost.
I think we have one more, Alexander.
Yeah.
From John Ski, wouldn't it be something if Trump attended Russia's May 9th victory celebration? Also, did you two meet to create the Duran? Oh, how did you two meet to create the Duran?
We did not create the Duran together. The Duran was created by Alex before we met. We met actually before. Well, we not before we met, but before I joined the Duran. So the Duran Alex was there at its inception. I came later, but we did meet before we set up the Duran, about a year before, as I remember. We met in Gorky Park and we discussed Greek politics and other things. We did not discuss the Duran then. We developed a great liking for each other and for our respective opinions, which were very similar about Greek politics, even though we come from different political backgrounds, if I can put it like that. And then when the Duran was set up, it was suggested to me by Alex that I come, and here it was. That's the story of our
May 9th victory celebration. Trump? No.
May 9th victory? No, it's not going to happen. I mean, he's not going. He's already said so, and I think he's right. I mean, normalize relations first, end the war in Ukraine, get us to a good position, and then maybe in 1, 2, 3 years' time he can go.
Yeah, we still have a long ways to go.
Long way to get there.
Yeah. Ziknas says, can you guys bring Andrei Martyanov and or Dmitry Orlov as guests back on again? They have fantastic insights. Keep up the good.
Absolutely, we would love to do that, and we certainly will.
From the other side, an Australian in Minsk, Belarus, says President Lukashenko had his presidential inauguration yesterday, so we have another 5 years of the legend.
Yes.
Alexander, that's everything. Final thoughts, and we'll wrap it up.
No, it's a wonderful program. But I mean, can I just say we are moving towards Istanbul Plus. Step by step, we will get there in the end. Zelensky is trying to create problems, as he did yesterday. But we see that when he does that, actually, it accelerates the process.
Yes, it does. All right. That is the live stream. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Odyssey, on Rockfin, Rumble, YouTube, and our locals community, the Duran.locals.com. Sparky says MLK Sr. was a prominent Atlanta Baptist clergyman and went to a Protestant convention in Dresden in the early 1930s. His son, MLK Jr., was the famous civil rights leader.
Right, interesting. Okay, gosh.
Thank you for that, Sparky. And I think that's everything. Thank you to our moderators, Peter, Zariel. We're moderating today. Harry as well. Thank you for moderating this chat. And we'll be back with videos. And Alexander, once again, plug the live stream on Locals, your stream tonight on Locals.
Absolutely. At 1400 hours EDT, I believe it's 1800 hours London time. I will check and I will make sure that people know, and I will put up a notification in a moment, and I'll be answering questions about all of the things that we've discussed today. And
the
other
Duran,
things too, no doubt.
right? The Duran.locals.com. The link is in the description box down below. Take care, everybody.
Mm-hmm.